Hello everyone, and welcome to this audio podcast. In this audio podcast series, in this audio podcast series, and this audio podcast synopsis and around the ZtormTronix case review v.3. This is an audio podcast series aligned to nephrology works, and sort of looking at works in and around how do young people 14 to 25 with chronic kidney disease or CKD cope, and what are the experiences between pediatric renal services and adult renal care. This audio podcast synopsis and this audio podcast synopsis and series this audio podcast series is aligned to Storm Robotics RFPB, and an audio podcast synopsis and series aligned to another Storm Robotics production. And so in context in around and in context of the audio podcast, this audio podcast synopses, this audio podcast synopses. The overview will in around this sort of works is as thus. Retrospectively, research had been conducted in looking in exploring and understanding, sort of getting the underpinnings or sort of perspectives from young people suffering with chronic kidney disease CKD in context of pediatric nephrology, and sort of retrospectively. CKD is an irreversible disease affecting various sort of across various sort of various populations, ethnicities, etc., and where individuals and patients, those who suffer with chronic kidney disease or CKD can have biochemistry, for example, physiological abnormalities in context of those important laboratory parameters which that can be affected, and thus implicating sort of daily life in young people with young people who are diagnosed and suffer with CKD. Aligned to this as well is where young people are affected in context can be affected in context of psychological and psychosocial well-being as well. So young people with CKD young people with CKD sort of pre and post transplant, for example, can face a lifetime of challenges associated with this particular chronic illness or this long term condition. Works that has been that had been published in around sort of pilot data to understand sort of coping strategies in young people with CKD stages 4 to 5, had identified sort of and identified various and several sort of coping mechanisms or strategies young people sort of use or utilize to cope with the sort of symptomology in around chronic kidney disease, and that's and works specifically in 2015 that had been published by that have been published with sort of pilot data again by Mohammed and team in 2015, and that sort of highlights some aspects and works in around this. However, further data is required to better understand how young people cope over time, and especially between pediatric renal services and adult renal care, and where they can have issues adhering to particular clinical or clinical practice aspects aligned to clinical practices or medical practices in context of symptomology as well. Now, this sort of research works, or this sort of application, if you like, can now looks to sort of put forward sort of the a basis in around where sort of research now can start to sort of address or seek to address sort of seek to address sort of aspects in around addressing coping mechanisms or coping mechanisms and the sort of issues and sort of seek to identify the issues that patients or recipients that the recipients may have where there may be challenges, where there may be challenges in addition in around aspects surrounding coping, but also in addition to whilst in and during transition, for example, between pediatric renal services and adult renal care. The research well, thus the research thus sort of seeks to explore or seeks to further identify and sort of understand strategies and mechanisms and the mechanistics to address if there is an association between positive coping and, for example, successful transition between pediatric renal services and adult renal care for those who suffer with chronic kidney disease, and by sort of delving into and understanding the experiences that that young people are sort of faced with. That young people with CKD or chronic kidney disease are sort of faced with. Now, specifically, the research looks to inform what coping strategies young people with chronic kidney disease, and young people with chronic kidney disease, and potentially siblings as well, adopt to adopt or sort of utilize, and to highlight the challenges that young people have with CKD, sort of pre and post transplant, sort of before, during, and after transition between sort of pediatric renal care, pediatric renal services, and adult renal care. And the study seeks to involve the implementation of sort of a mixed methodology approach, where qualitative and quantitative data collection methods will be sort of implemented or sort of applied in order to gain an in-depth understanding of how young people with CKD, again pre and post transplant, and potentially siblings as well, also sort of cope and sort of siblings sort of cope, and also identify what sort of concerns what sort of concerns are sort of raised before, during, and after sort of transition between pediatric renal services and adult renal care, and thus collecting data, and thus where this research seeks to this research sort of aspect seeks to collect data at several time points over, for example, 18 months, over 18 months, for example, and where the in line to this, in line to sort of in line to sort of the data collection aspects, the basis is where previous research that looked at that had collected pilot data in line to identifying coping strategies in young people, and in published works from 2015, where participants were recruited to help inform aspects around the research, around the particular research question about coping strategies. Participants were recruited from a pediatric nephrology department within a hospital, within a children's hospital in the United Kingdom, and also a youth club, a youth club in the United Kingdom. The basis in around this in this sort of in this sort of works, the base and the sort of proposition. The proposition is to seek to have involvement and recruitment between two and four sort of mainly in the main two in the main between 2 and 4 pediatric or children's hospitals, where in between 2 and 4 pediatric children's pediatric pediatrics or children's hospitals, where, for example, participants are recruited to be involved in to be involved in again to sort of help answer and inform sort of inform aspects in around the sort of the in around the main sort of question, the main sort of excuse me, in around the main sort of question in around to how do young people ages between 14 to 25 with CKD cope, and what are the experiences between pediatric renal services and adult renal care, and aligned to this, where 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 at the same time from the qualitative perspective, it would be where participants are involved to help answer particular and sort of pivotal sort of questions that sort of help that will help identify the coping strategies, etc. that young people utilize to sort of cope with CKD. So the qualitative aspect is participation for young people to be involved to help answer questions aligned to coping with chronic kidney disease, between 2 and 4 pediatric renal pediatric or children's hospitals, and also where from the quantitative perspective or quantitative side, in line to the sort of the numerical basis in around this sort of works or research is to have up to 100 up to about 100 young people for example, CKD at various stages, for example, chronic kidney disease at various stages, and also sort of siblings to complete a paper or online version of a validated coping survey in this investigation, in this research, or in this research or this works, and where all young people will be are invited to complete the sort of validated coping survey that's been referred that has been referred to and used has been utilized in previous research. It's referred to as the ways of coping survey, or ways, by Folkman and Lazarus in the 1980s. And at halfway time point during this particular works or this research, and at the same time by collecting data, utilizing a sort of dual approach, i.e., once again, a sort of quantitative and qualitative approach, allows a sort of a basis in around understanding how young people cope with CKD, and also where data in context of this sort of works looks to sort of be collected sort of from a longitudinal basis, which will thus then sort of help to understand and sort of implement hope to sort of help to understand sort of aspects in around coping from a mixed methodology approach, but also will allow with the data collected, the basis will then be to sort of put forward a sort of a formal coping and sort of transition sort of guideline to complement clinical practice for young people suffering with chronic kidney disease or CKD, and the guideline would be developed further in the basis in around this as well would be that the guideline a guideline would be developed was sought to be developed further in collaboration between the participatory sites and be tested or implemented thereafter, and ultimately where a formal guideline in around coping in around how young people cope with chronic kidney disease, and sort of the experiences between pediatric renal services and adult renal care, would seek to offer a sort of a solution or a basis to improve sort of the sort of experiences of young people in this particular this sort of area, or this sort of aspect of healthcare. So that is the sort of that is sort of the synopses, if you like, in around this sort of works, and also to as a sort of side aspect to this is that the data collection in context of from the qualitative perspective, the basis would be to collect to have sort of one-to-one face-to-face interviews, for example, at time 0 months, at time 6 months, at time 12 months, and at time 18 months, to again identify the sort of coping strategies that can be sort of evidenced and documented in context of a formal in context of a formal coping sort of in context of a formal coping guideline for those suffering with chronic kidney disease, and those suffering with chronic kidney disease, and in context of the nephrology specialty as well. So thank you for tuning in on this audio podcast synopsis. This has been an audio podcast synopsis in around the series, the ZtormTronix case review v.3, and an audio podcast aligned to a Storm Robotics RFPB. This is an audio podcast aligned to looking at nephrology and how do young people with CKD cope, and what are the experiences between pediatric renal services and adult renal care. Thank you for tuning in.